How you doing this morning? Good. Hopefully everyone's doing well. Let me ask you a question. Have you ever thought about the Bible story as a whole? Have you ever just sat down and just thought about the story? How would you describe it? I've been thinking about this for the last couple of weeks ago, and I think I've sort of decided that if I were to simplify, or I guess really oversimplify the Bible story, I would say it's a story of conflict. It's a story of conflict where there are essentially two sides. You've got God on one side, and you have Satan, you have the enemy on the other side. And if you have to expand that out further, if you have to expand it out further from God and further from Satan, you could sort of say you have God's people, righteous people, on one side, and you have the wicked world on the other side. So you seem to have these two categories, and sometimes the way that the Bible explains or describes these two competing sides is by using the imagery of cities. The world, the wicked world, is represented by one city, and God's people, the righteous world, represented by another city. You see this early on in God's story. You see it in the book of Genesis. In the book of Genesis, cities are never a good thing. They're always looked at in a negative light. And the reason behind this is, I think Moses, the author of Genesis, is trying to symbolize, through the use of these cities, he's trying to symbolize the wicked world. We see this in Genesis chapter 4. Go ahead and open up your Bibles there. Genesis chapter 4, and if you want, you can put a bookmark in Revelation 18 or so, because we're going to be there a lot. But first, Genesis chapter 4. This is the context where Cain has killed Abel. And picking up in verse 10, God tells Cain his punishment. Verse 10, and the Lord said, "What have you done? The voice of your brother's blood is crying to me from the ground. And now you are cursed from the ground, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you work the ground, it shall no longer yield to you its strength." And pay attention to this last part of verse 12. "You shall be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth." So Cain has killed his brother Abel, and God says here in the text, "You shall be a fugitive and wanderer on the earth." But what does Cain do in response? How does Cain respond to God's punishment that he should be a wanderer on the earth? Let's jump down to verse 17. Verse 17 of Genesis chapter 4, it says, "Cain knew his wife, and she conceived and bore Enoch. When he built a city, he called the name of the city after the name of his son, Enoch." So God tells Cain, you're going to be a wanderer on the earth. What does Cain do? He builds the city instead. Well, that's quite literally the opposite of being a wanderer on the earth. When you're building a city, you're kind of setting up a base camp. You're not going anywhere. So this first city that we see in all of Scripture is built as an act of rebellion against God. And we continue to see this in the book of Genesis. Think about Sodom and Gomorrah. They are wicked cities. So over and over again in Genesis, and to a lesser extent the rest of the Bible, cities are used to describe the wicked world. And every now and then, Bible authors will give this wicked city a name. Do you know what they'll call it? They'll call the city Babylon. It is sort of like a symbolic Babylon. So why do they call this symbolic wicked city Babylon? Well, they call this city Babylon because the actual city, the literal city Babylon, was a very wicked city. And again, we see this early on in the text, Genesis chapter 11. You guys know what happens in Genesis chapter 11. It's something that we teach in Bible class. Kids know this story. Genesis chapter 11 contains the story of the Tower of what? Tower of Babel. And it's interesting, in the text, the city in the tower is not really called Babel, but it's Babylon. The Hebrew word that's translated there is the word Babel. And throughout the Old Testament, that word Babel is always translated Babylon, except for here. So what we really see in Genesis 11 is we see a city called Babylon. And this city, what are they doing? Well, they're rebelling against God. God said, "Be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth." They say, "No, we're going to gather all in one place and try and ultimately be God." So we see this wicked city, Babylon, at the beginning of the story. We see it during Israelite history as well in the book of Daniel. We see the literal city of Babylon. They've taken Judah into captivity. And what we see in the book of Daniel is that this is a wicked city. But we don't only see the city in the Old Testament. We see the city in the New Testament as well. And someone might say, well, how do we see Babylon in the New Testament? Well, it's because the New Testament authors use Babylon as this symbol for the wicked world. We see this in 1 Peter. 1 Peter chapter 5, at the end of the book, Peter says, she who is at Babylon, who is likewise chosen, sends you greetings. So Peter says, she who is at Babylon, the literal Babylon? No. What Peter is saying is the world is wicked like Babylon. So Babylon becomes this symbol for the wicked world. And so Peter's not talking about literal Babylon. He's talking about a symbolic Babylon. And we see the same thing in the book of Revelation. The book of Revelation talks about this wicked city called Babylon. And it's not the literal Babylon. It's a symbolic Babylon used to describe the wicked world. So underneath the Bible story, undergirding the Bible story and the history of mankind, what do we see? Well, we see a tale of two cities. On one hand, you have the city of the world, the city of the wicked world called Babylon. And on the other hand, you have the city called New Jerusalem. And this represents God's city. This represents the righteous world. Well, that's what we're going to talk about in the lesson this morning. We're going to talk about these two cities. We're going to talk about Babylon first, and then we're going to talk about this New Jerusalem. We're going to look at the characteristics of these cities, compare them, and then at the end, I'll give one big point of application. This sermon is not the way I typically do sermons. I've been doing, new things for the last couple of weeks. This sermon is really a sermon over an overarching theme in the Bible, sort of a deeper theme that we see just that crosses the entire Bible and human history as a whole. So this is an important lesson. I think it's important for us. It's important for us, especially in the time that we live in today. And I think there's going to be a good point of application that will help us. So are you guys ready? You guys ready to learn about these two cities? First, we're going to deal with the city of the world, the city that could be called Babylon. What are some of the characteristics of this city and the people who live in it? Well, I have 4 points for you. First of all, the people who live in this city are prideful. We see pride in this city. Someone might say, well, how are they prideful? Well, the citizens of this city, they don't trust in God. As a matter of fact, they trust in self rather than trust in God. They don't trust God's wisdom or God's power. They trust their own wisdom and their own power. And what is that, really? Well, it's pride. We see this with Nebuchadnezzar. Let's go back to Daniel chapter 3, looking at literal Babylon again. Literal Babylon, Daniel chapter 3. And in this context, we see Nebuchadnezzar really show his pride here. Daniel chapter 3 and verse 1, it says, King Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold whose height was 60 cubits and its breadth 6 cubits. He set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. So here in this context, King Nebuchadnezzar, he builds this statue. And this is Nebuchadnezzar's way of saying, I don't trust you, God. I trust myself. Now, someone might say, well, Reuben, how do you see that in this verse? Is all of that really in this verse? Well, really, it is. If you keep this verse in its context, you really start to see the pride of God, or the pride of King Nebuchadnezzar, and his lack of trust in God. Do you remember what happened in the previous chapter in Daniel chapter 2? In that chapter, King Nebuchadnezzar, he has a dream. And he has a dream of this statue, kind of like the statue that he built in chapter 3 and verse 1. And this statue was made of gold. It had a chest of silver. It had thighs of bronze, legs of iron, and feet of iron and clay. And King Nebuchadnezzar doesn't know what to do with this dream, so Daniel has to interpret the dream for him. And Daniel tells him, you're the head of gold in the statue of your dream. You're the head of gold. But your kingdom isn't going to last forever. That's what Daniel tells to the king. That's what God ultimately tells King Nebuchadnezzar. Your kingdom, your golden kingdom, isn't going to last forever. There's another kingdom that's going to follow you, and it's a silver kingdom, so to speak. And how does King Nebuchadnezzar respond? Well, King Nebuchadnezzar responds by saying, well, I don't trust your statue, God. I'm going to build my own statue. And in Nebuchadnezzar's statue, it's not just made with a head of gold and a chest of silver and so on and so forth. Nebuchadnezzar's statue is entirely gold. So essentially, Nebuchadnezzar tells God, I trust my own wisdom and my own power over yours. Well, that's the way this city is. This symbolic Babylon is the same way. They trust their own wisdom, their own power, rather than God's wisdom and God's power. And ultimately, where this leads them is it leads them to this desire to be God. If you don't trust in God's wisdom, if you don't trust in God's power, and you think you could do it better, then you think you deserve to sit in God's seat. You see, these people also desire to be God. And we see this in Isaiah chapter 14. Isaiah chapter 14, let's go in that context. In that context, God is talking, really, it's sort of a song against the king of Babylon. I guess you could say it's the people talking, but God is talking about the king of Babylon. Here in Isaiah chapter 14, picking up in verse 12, it says, How you are fallen from heaven, O day star, son of dawn. How you are cut down to the ground, you who laid the nations low. You said in your heart, I will ascend to heaven above the stars of God. I will set my throne on high. I will sit on the mount of assembly in far reaches of the north. I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. I will make myself like the Most High. So here the king of Babylon speaks. He says, I will be like God. I can do it better. And some people might say, well, no, that's talking about Satan. Verse 12, Lucifer is there, and that's Satan. No, that's not Satan. You know, this verse in its context is talking about the king of Babylon, and that some translations use Lucifer, but star of dawn or star of the morning or day star is probably a better translation for that. So this is talking about the king of Babylon. We see that in verse 4 of chapter 14. Verse 4, it says, you will take up this taunt against who? Well, against the king of Babylon. And verse 12 through 14 just fit right into that context. So what do we see from this city, this wicked city? Well, we see pride. They don't trust God. In fact, they want to be God. But because of their pride, because they don't trust God, because they think they're wiser than God, well, they don't live according to God's will. So you could say that this city is also rebellious. We see this in John's description of this city. Revelation chapter 18, please. That's where we're going to be for a little while, so you can just turn there. Revelation chapter 18. In this context, John describes this city, this symbolic Babylon, and it's a great wicked city. But notice how John, or really how God describes this city in verse 1 and following. It says, after this, I saw another angel coming down from heaven, having great authority, and the earth was made bright with his glory. And he called out with a mighty voice, Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great. She has become a dwelling place for demons, a haunt for every unclean spirit, a haunt for every unclean bird, a haunt for every unclean and detestable beast. So do you see how this symbolic Babylon is described? Described as a dwelling place for the demons, as a place for all of these unclean things. Why does God describe this city this way? Because they're morally corrupt. Because this is an unrighteous city. And notice with me that they're just not morally, this city is not just morally corrupt in and of itself. This city also seeks and pushes to corrupt others as well. Look at the very next verse, verse 3 of Revelation 18. It says, For all nations have drunk the wine of the passion of her sexual immorality, and the kings of the earth have committed immorality with her. So Babylon is not just described as being a corrupt city, but it's a corrupting city. It's like a virus. It wants to spread its moral depravity. And that's what we see from symbolic Babylon. That's not the only thing that we see. Since this city doesn't like the truth, doesn't want to accept God's truth, well, they don't like people who preach truth either. This city also persecutes the righteous. Look at verse 24 of Revelation chapter 18. Verse 24, it says, and after everything was said about the city, verse 24 says, and in her was found the blood of prophets and of saints and of all who have been slain on the earth. So the blood of prophets and saints are in this city. Why? What are prophets supposed to do? They're supposed to preach truth, aren't they? They're supposed to preach God's message. Well, the people who live in this symbolic Babylon, they don't like that. So they persecute the righteous. The righteous suffer in this city. I'm aware that this context is talking about Rome and the Roman Empire and how they persecuted Christians at this time. But we need to remember that this doesn't only apply to Rome. Just like Babylon didn't only apply to Babylon. Babylon was also Rome in the book of Revelation. And Babylon also describes the world as we see it today. So this city, it persecutes the righteous. But notice with me also this city seems to offer so much. Let's go back to verse 3. Verse 3, after it talks about how the kings commit immorality with this city, it says, "And the merchants of the earth have grown rich from the power of her luxurious living." So we see a couple of things here. The people who live in this city, they get rich off of this city. It says they live in luxury, they live in peace. And this is something that we continue to see as we read. Look at verse 9. "And the kings of earth who committed sexual immorality and lived in what? In luxury with her." Verse 15, "The merchants of these wares who gained wealth from her." Yeah, the people of this city, they're very wicked people. But it seems like they're just prospering. It seems like they're doing pretty well for themselves. So this city, this wicked city, Babylon, seems to offer so much. Persecutes the righteous, rebels against God, and lives in pride. Does that sound familiar? Doesn't that sound like our world today? Think about our world with me for just a second. Is our world prideful? Does our world trust in self more than it trusts in God? You know, it's interesting. God can create man in a certain way. God can create me and you in a certain way. And the world looks at that and they say, no, God messed up. I know God created me in a certain way, but I'm really the other way. Why? Because I'm smarter than God. I have it figured out, and he messed up. And our world is also rebellious as well. Our world is a corrupting presence, corrupts others. Our world persecutes the righteous, and I think that's just going to increasingly be so as the wicked world becomes less tolerant and less tolerant of the truth. And with regard to the last point, in our world, the wicked seem to prosper. Our world seems to offer the wicked so much. So that's what we see about this city Babylon. But I mentioned in the introduction that we're talking about a tale of two cities. We're talking about another city. And the other city that I want to spend some time talking about is New Jerusalem, this city that represents God's history. And I want to talk about the characteristics of this New Jerusalem and the characteristics of its people. So what do we see about this city? Well, the city and the people in this city, they trust in God. We see this early on in human history. Let's go to Hebrews chapter 11. Hebrews chapter 11, please. I say early on in human history, and I go to Hebrews. I know that's kind of ironic, but it'll fit. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 8. It says, "By faith Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to a place that he was to receive as an inheritance. And he went out, not knowing where he was going. By faith he went to live in the land of promise, as in a foreign land, living in tents with Isaac and Jacob, heirs with him of the same promise." Now pay attention to verse 10, because verse 10 is important. For Abraham, was looking forward to what? Looking forward to the city that has foundations, whose designer and builder is God. So we see here that Abraham was looking forward to this city. And it's interesting that Abraham, in some sense, was already a part of the city of God, because he was a righteous man. So in some sense, Abraham was already a part of this city, but in another sense, he was not yet a part of this city. I know it's kind of mind-blowing, but I guess just remember two phrases that might help out. Remember already, and remember not yet. In one sense, Abraham was already a part of God's city. In another sense, he was not yet a part of God's city, because God's city hadn't fully come. And the same is true for us as well, by the way. We are, in some sense, already a part of God's city, already a part of God's kingdom. But there's another sense in which God's kingdom has not yet fully come. And we are looking forward to that city. So that's what we see here with Abraham. Abraham is looking forward to the city. And why? Why is he looking forward to this city? I think it tells us in the text. Abraham is looking forward to the city because the city's designer and builder is God. You see, the citizens of this city trust God, and that's why we look forward to the fullness of the city. We trust that God is able to make a city that we cannot make. We trust that God's creation is greater than our own, and that God's creation will never fail. That's what Abraham did. So you see, the citizens of this city, they're not like citizens of Babylon. Citizens of Babylon, they have pride in themselves, trust themselves, don't trust God. Citizens of this city do trust in God. But notice with me also that the citizens of the city and the city itself is righteous. Let's go to Revelation chapter 21 now. Revelation chapter 21. In this context, we see New Jerusalem. We see this city. In Revelation 18, we saw Babylon, the wicked city. Revelation 21, we see the righteous city, New Jerusalem. Now look at verse 27 of Revelation chapter 21. Describing this city, it says, "But nothing unclean will ever enter it, nor anyone who does what is detestable or false, but only those who are written in the Lamb's book of life." The city of Babylon was described as a place for demons. But Revelation 21 says that kind of thing is not going on in God's city. Nothing unclean will ever enter it. See, this is a city that is a righteous city, but it's not just righteous in and of itself. Let's look at verse 24. Go back up a little bit to verse 24. The text says, by its light, the nations will walk, and the kings of the earth will bring their glory into it. So talking about this city, the text says that this city encourages us, or really encourages the world to be righteous. It encourages others to be righteous. You know, we talked about how the city, the symbolic Babylon, corrupts others. Well, this city guides people to God. And by the way, you sort of see that already not yet theme running through this verse. Because verse 24 is obviously not talking about heaven if it's talking about bringing people to the truth. So verse 24 is talking about an already aspect of this city, an already aspect of the kingdom, and not a not yet aspect. You guys know what I'm saying. So the city of Babylon corrupts nations, but this city is righteous. This city sort of reverse corrupts nations. Can I say that? It does it in reverse. You know, it helps nations, makes them clean, cleanses nations. But notice with me also that this nation, this city, New Jerusalem, seems to offer little. Emphasis on that word seems. From the outside looking in, this nation seems to offer so little. When we talked about Babylon, we talked about how that nation seemed to offer so much. Even though the people were very wicked, they were prospering within the context. They were wealthy, they were at peace, they were living in luxury in the context. Well, in the book of Revelation, how are the righteous people doing? How are the Christians doing early on in Revelation? They're being persecuted. They're dying for being righteous. As a matter of fact, history tells us there are Christians who were starving to death because of their faith in Jesus. People wouldn't sell them food. See, from the outside looking in, you could say that this city, this New Jerusalem, offers so little. But in reality, this city offers true value. This city offers true peace. Look at verse 4 of chapter 21. Revelation, verse 4 of chapter 21. It says, "He will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and death shall be no more, neither shall there be mourning, nor crying, nor pain anymore, for the former things have passed away." We see that already not yet sort of theme running through Revelation 21. This is talking about the not yet, when the city will fully be revealed. You know, it's interesting, Revelation 21 has had centuries of interpretation where people are like, is it talking about the kingdom now? Is it talking about the church now? Is it talking about heaven? The answer to that is yes. It's talking about both. And we see that through the context. But here it's talking about when the city fully arrives, there's going to be no what? No mourning, no crying, no pain. The righteous will suffer no more. You see, this city in its fullness offers true peace. That's not the only thing that we see here as far as what of value that this city offers. Look at verse 22. Down in verse 22, in verse 23, it says, "And I saw no temple in the city." Why? "For its temple is the Lord God, the Almighty, and the Lamb. And the city has no need of sun or moon to shine on it, for the glory of God gives its light, and its lamp is the Lamb." Let me ask, have you ever gone through hard times and you've knelt to God in prayer and asked, "Where are you?" Has the world been so dark that you've talked to God and asked, "Are you seeing this? Are you listening? Are you there?" What we see in these verses is that God is in this city with his people. And again, we got a little bit of already, not yet. There's a sense in which God is spiritually with us. But in the fullness, God will really dwell with his people. You know what I call that? True value. That's what really matters. Let's go to the next chapter now, Revelation 22, picking up in verse 1. We see another thing here. Revelation 22 and verse 1. "Then the angel showed me the river of the water of life, bright as crystal, flowing from the throne of God and of the Lamb through the middle of the street of the city. Also on either side of the river, the tree of life with its 12 kinds of fruit, yielding its fruit each month. The leaves of the tree were for the healing of the nations." Well, what else do we see in this city? The same tree that we see at the beginning of the story, the tree of life, and we also see that here in this city. And we get a little bit of hint. I'm going to mention it one more time because I want you guys to remember it. We get a hint of this already not yet theme making its play, because the tree of life obviously refers to eternity. But the fact that its leaves were for the healing of the nations, the fact that all nations can come and be a part of this kingdom, that's already here. So we see a little bit of already not yet. But this city, what does it offer? It offers true value. Why? Because it offers true life. You know, sometimes people in the world will look at us as Christians and say, "You know what, you're not truly living because God is holding you back." That's not true. They've just missed the point. True life is found in God's city. True life is found in New Jerusalem. So why have I said all of this? I've gone through this long sermon, talked about some, things. Why have I said all this? Well, when the world looks hopeless and dark, kind of like today, kind of like the world, the discouraging world, I think, that we're living in now, the discouraging times that we're living in now. I mean, just think about it. We live in a world where we're splitting services. You only see half of the congregation once a week. And when we do see one another, we can't really hug one another's neck. That's discouraging. Or if you go to a funeral, you can't really comfort someone else because 6 feet. Or you go to a wedding and you can't rejoice with those who rejoice because social distancing. The world is very discouraging at times. But when the world seems dark and discouraging and it seems like there's no hope, there's something that we need to remember. We need to remember where our citizenship is. You guys with me? Good. When the world is dark and hopeless, we need to remember where our citizenship is. Paul is a good example of this. In the book of Philippians, Paul is where no one really wants to be. He's in prison. But over and over again in the text, he talks about the joy that he has. And you almost want to say, well, man, how is Paul able to have so much joy? And around the middle of the book, he gives us the answer through the book, but around the middle of the book, it's almost made explicit. He says, for our citizenship is where? It's in heaven. So when you look around the world and you see Babylon, this horrible, wicked city where demons rule, I'm speaking symbolically, but where demons rule, we need to remember where our citizenship is. Our citizenship is in God's city. Our city offers true value. Now, I want to go back to a point that I made earlier. Earlier, I made the point that this wicked city, the city of symbolic Babylon, seems to offer so much. I want to re-examine that point here for just a second. What does this city truly offer? Well, when you think about the nation of Babylon, what happened to that nation? It's gone. It's not here anymore. Think about the nation of Rome. What happened to that nation? It's gone. Well, this symbolic Babylon, just like literal Babylon and literal Rome, this symbolic Babylon will be destroyed as well. Back to Revelation chapter 18 for just a moment. Revelation chapter 18, let's look at verse 10. Verse 10 at the end of the verse, it says, "For in a single hour your judgment has come," talking about this city. Now look at verse 17. "For in a single hour all this wealth," remember Babylon seems to offer so much. "For in a single hour all this wealth has been laid waste." Verse 19 now at the end of the verse, "For in a single hour she has been laid waste." And then finally in verse 21, "Then a mighty angel took up a stone like a great millstone and threw it into the sea, saying, So will Babylon, the great city, be thrown down with violence and will be found no more." What's the reality of the wicked city, Babylon? Well, it's going to be destroyed. But God's city will stand forever. So let me ask you a question. Which city do you want to be a part of? Maybe there's someone here this morning who realizes they were a part of God's city, but they left, turned in the citizenship card, and joined Babylon. And you realize, Babylon's not where I need to be. You want to come back to the Lord, you want to gain your citizenship back, we'd love to help you with that. Or maybe there's someone who hasn't become a child of God yet, but you want to be. You want to have your citizenship in a city that contains true value. We'd love to help you with that. If you need to respond to the invitation, you can come now as we stand and as we sing.